Hey everyone, Skeletor here. I'm doing another video here on WoWAnalyzer. As you can see and probably already know, WoWAnalyzer did have a recent overhaul. So my new video, while still having good information, does not match how the site looks. So I'm making a new video here. I'm gonna go on a short rant, shorter than usual, just to cover the basics for every video. Is that if you're looking at your logs to see how to perform, you should ignore parses, ignore your overall parse, ignore your item level parse. Those are not very good indicators of performance in certain scenarios. The best thing you can do is focus on your own performance, which comes down to your rotation and how you play. You shouldn't rely on parses. You shouldn't blame your stats, your gems, your enchants, your gear, your Azerite, your trinkets. If you want to improve, you have to do it yourself. And I'm going to show you here how you can. So, short rant. So we'll just jump right into it here. Again, we're just picking some random logs here. I do have a selection of logs today to show off some new features. And I guess the first thing that we usually do is we bring up a log and we look at their gear. So we can use the character tab here on WoWAnalyzer. And this is the new display. You can see their talents, their Azerite, their stats on pull. You can mouse over the gear. It's all there. Sometimes the icons don't load, but if you mouse over, you can see what it is. It doesn't show the Azerite on the tooltip, but again, it does show it here. And usually what you want to do is you want to sim your own character to see what will work best for you. Now, I don't have this person's input, but I'm just going to demonstrate what I would do. So I'll switch to my Raidbots tab here. We're going to use the top gear tab, and like it says here, it says paste input from the Simulation Craft add-on. Make sure to install that add-on. You go in game, you do /simc, you paste your input into this window. And it gives you your gear. Now, I don't actually have all this gear, I just have it added here to show. Your gear that's already being worn is selected. So if you want to compare Azerite traits on gear, what you can do was, let's say on your chest, you also want to sim Light's Decree. You click on it. It's that easy. If you want to add a new piece, click on that. If you want to add a piece that's not yet being simmed, click on it. Click on the traits that you want to sim. Scroll down, go to your other slots. Do you have things you want to compare? Do you want to know if your 420 legs or your 415 sockets are better? Sim it and find out. You want to compare your trinkets? Compare your trinkets. Just pick a few of them. Now, I'm a trinket hoarder, as I've mentioned. I hoard all types of trinkets. You don't have to do this, but I recommend definitely hanging on to the higher item level trinkets that you may have. But you pretty much go through like that. If you want to sim weapons, choose different weapons. If you need to add enchants to your gear, select your enchants. For your ring, weapon, select your gems. Now, as far as gems and enchants go, I would uncheck always use. You don't always want to use strength. That's not the case. Now, you shouldn't want to replace your existing gems and enchants. It's usually very minor in terms of DPS. And it also makes the sim take a lot longer. Because you see here right now, it's 144 combinations. I check the button, and all of a sudden it's too many. So just use this for new gear. So when you get new gear that can be enchanted or socketed, just have these selected and it will fill it in for you. If you want to compare talents, you can do that. Use your talents. Change your settings. Now you need to use Smart Sim on top gear. If you want to do patchwork, do patchwork. If you want AoE, use Dungeon Slice. If you want to execute, there's execute. Do what you want. If you want to change other settings, you can. I recommend you keep the SimC on the nightly version. You can change your Treacherous Covenant uptime. Usually leaving it on 100 is okay. Most of the time you have 95% or higher, and that's pretty close to 100. But if you want to lowball it, you can pick 90. But also, what I'll show you later is that WoWAnalyzer will show you your uptime. And you can adjust from that if you want to. You pretty much do that. You notice by default here, high precision is checked, which is, it's more precise, but it's a bit slower. We'll run that. It'll take a moment to run in the background. So we'll get back to it. But you just want to make sure that your gear that you already have is optimal for you. That's the point. All right. So one thing that we like to check is if consumables were used. Now on the overview page, it will tell you here if you scroll down on this checklist, it's be well prepared. All enchants, used to pre-potion, flask used, food used, high quality enchants, second potion, high quality food. Now sometimes it doesn't quite properly report pre-potion or second potion, so you want to double check in the log. So just go to the log, go to buffs, and find your potion. In this case, we see battle potion of strength. We see one use there. We scroll down just in case. We don't see a different potion hiding in there, so it looks like there was one potion used on this fight. But it did report two. So again, you can just always double check it yourself here. It's what's best. We'll just check on our sim. Oh, a sim just finished, you see? It would actually suggest that I would swap my traits in setup. It says I should switch from Crusade to Inquisition. I should change my helmet, and I should change my trinket. That's why it's always best to sim your character and find out what's best for you. It might not always match what you're already wearing. And if you scroll down, you can see the results. So this is 2.5% better than what I was wearing. So that's pretty straightforward. Yeah, so potion, there's only one potion used, but to get marked as 2 used, so not a huge issue, but you want to make sure to use your potions. You use your one pre-pull, and you use your one later in the fight with your wings. Pretty straightforward. Now what we do from there is we usually jump into the opener. And the 2 ways we can do that is we can use the Warcraft logs to go to casts, the timeline, or just use the timeline on Raidbots. Now the timeline on Raidbots is a bit different now, as you'll see. It takes a little bit to get used to. All of your abilities used are on a single line now and not split up, but beneath it still does show the cooldowns of the abilities. One of the nice new features is that above the timeline, it'll show you when your buffs were active. Now, I started to contribute to WoWAnalyzer recently, so I added a few things to it, such as like Inquisition showing up and Avenging Wrath and Imperium Power. Also, things like Divine Purpose will show up. So I just put some useful information there, and some other logs I'll show you some more information as well. But for now, the opener. So the opener, we don't see a judgment there, so she probably used a pre-judgment into a blade, into Inquisition, and then a trinket here. When you use an off global cooldown ability, it'll show up on the bottom here and insert it with an arrow. So it went trinket, then wings, and then wake, and Divine Storm. In this case, it was Divine Storm because it's Rosticon and it's AoE at the start, so that's okay. So opener was almost there. The only thing that I would change is I would want to make sure that I was using my trinket after my wings. I would use it with the first global, so I would have used this with the Wake of Ashes, just to get another GCD or 2 inside that trinket window for a little bit more damage. And if you ever need to check openers, you can always use my guide, of course, here. There's a little drop down up top here to go over it. It's in the priority system section and the openers. And you can double check openers here. And scroll down and find. I know one of the more common builds right now is the Righteous Verdict, Hammer, Wrath, Wake, Crusade. And this actually works the same as Execution Sentence. You just replace your Execution Sentence with the Templar's Verdict. As an example there, so Blade, Judge, Crusade. Templars, Wake, Templars, Hammer, Execution, or Templars. So again, this isn't all the possible openers. This is just a select few. But there's also some general opener tips here as well that you can follow. Also, you can see, like I mentioned, the pre-potion was used here. Now, sometimes it does show intellect on the timeline, and you can ignore that. It's a little bit buggy. That's why you can always double check in the log. And in the log, we did see that it actually was a battle potion of strength. But the pre-potion was used, so that was good. So the opener, not too bad. Just one little thing I would adjust there, otherwise good. So one of the other things that we go over is the waste of holy power, which we can find on the stats page. We're going to scroll down here on the stats page. Holy power usage. So there was 1 wasted by Blade and 5 wasted from Wake. So for Blade, you never want to waste HP with Blade. This also applies to Crusader Strike, Judgment, and Hammer Wrath. You want to avoid that. Now Wake, sometimes it is okay to waste HP, and it depends. You never want to use Wake when you have 2 holy power. You want to use a builder first and then a spender. And if you have 1 holy power and your blade is not on cooldown, you want a blade first, then use a spender, and then use Wake. But one of the new things I've added to track lists is in the timeline. So we'll go back to the timeline. And we can scroll over. We're just going to scroll over a bit until we see some red. So there's one instance there, but we'll get into that later. And we see here's where Blade was cast at 4 holy power. Make sure to either use a 1 holy power generator or a holy power spender first to avoid overcapping. And when we went through there, we didn't see any highlights on Wake. Well, let's do a quick double check though, just to make sure I didn't miss it. But what it looks like, in this case, all that holy power waste from Wake is okay. So there was no issues there, so this is a good example of how to do it right. And as you go across the timeline, you can just look for that. But we'll get more into that as well. Now, for a different example here of what it would look like, is you would see it like this from a different log. Here's someone who used Wake of Ashes. If you mouse over it, it says 2 holy power or more wasted. You should either use or wait for a holy power generator and spend before using Wake. So the highlights make it a bit easier to pinpoint those issues down. One of the other things I've also added is on the stats page. Like, one of the common things that we had to look for that was a bit of a pain is you wanted to make sure that your Wake of Ashes hit a target. I've now added that to WoWAnalyzer itself. On the stats page here, when you do have Wake talented, you have this little target hit display. So in this case, it was 1.33 average. There's a little info card here that says you averaged 1.33 hits per cast Wake of Ashes. So in this case, it means every time Wake was used, a target was hit. Now, if we go to a different log here, let me find one. I have a couple of them open, so I apologize. Here's one, where if you do miss a target with your Wake of Ashes, it'll show like this. You'll see your average, and you'll see 1 missed. And on the info card, it says you averaged 0.75 hits per cast of Wake of Ashes. Additionally, you cast Wake of Ashes 1 time without hitting anything. And that will also show in the overview tab here. If you go here and scroll down, under suggestions, there's Wake of Ashes hit 0 targets 1 times. Blade of Justice has the same range of 12 yards. You can use this as a guideline to tell if targets will be in range. So a little tip there for Wake usage if you run into it. We'll go back to the main log here. So one thing we'll go over is Inquisition. Some people use Inquisition, and with 8.1.5, we might see some more people using it due to some changes. So we can see here is Inquisition damage buffed at 99.18%. That's very good. You always want to have 99% or higher. If you're not hitting the 99% damage buff mark, you should use a different talent. There's a little info card here. It also tells you how long it was active for in terms of uptime, but uptime is not important. What's important is how much damage was buffed. Now, to track Inquisition, you seen earlier, there was a red mark on Inquisition earlier. So let's scroll over to find it here. You see here, this you refreshed Inquisition during Avenging Wrath. It is better to refresh early before Avenging Wrath, so you can spend holy power on damage during it. So you can see here she used her Avenging Wrath, which has this little bar here. It ends here. So you can see in the middle of her wings, she had to go back and use Inquisition. So before she went in to this wings, she would have wanted to use Inquisition first for an early refresh to make sure it lasted the entire duration of her wings. So just a small little tip there as well. And I also do cover that in my guide in the rotation section or priority system section. So you can check that out again. It's here. Like where the openers is, it's right in here. The information you need is all right there. Look for it. Read each little section that you need. Don't overwhelm yourself. The guide itself is pretty long. So that's why it's best you just focus on the individual section that you need help with. If you need help with your rotation, look at the rotation section and go from there. Alright, so general rotation. There's two ways to look at this. First, from the overview page, you want to check for some things, like here is use core abilities as often as possible. Spells with short cooldowns like Judgment, Blade of Justice, Crusader Strike should be used as often as possible. We can see here Blade looks pretty good overall. Judgment is a little bit delayed. In Crusader Strike, sometimes it can be low and that's okay. Sometimes being low might be a sign of other issues. And we can find out more information about this in the timeline. You'll see in the timeline there's these little yellow bars, and this is the global cooldown. And sometimes you'll see, before the next ability, there is a gap. That gap indicates that there was a delay before the next ability was used. And those little delays can add up. But one thing we want to look to see if is being properly done is if Blade is being used before Judgment. Because one of the things in the rotation is that Blade has a higher priority. And the reason being is that Blade has a cooldown of 6 globals, and Judgment has a cooldown of 7 globals. So if you use Judgment first, and then use Blade, they're both going to come off of cooldown at the same time and cause a cooldown clash. And we want to try to avoid that as much as possible. So you just scroll along the timeline. We can see here that Blade was used over Judgment, so that's good. You see, for the most part, pretty good. The abilities are being chained pretty well. We got our first little bit of a gap here where their ability was available. In this case, probably a couple. We can see there's a large block of downtime here that they used horse for some reason. On Rastakhan, sometimes you might have to move. Like sometimes people might accidentally spread fire, and if fire is spreading, you might have to run out. That can cause issues. Other parts of Rastakhan include things like Inevitable End, which you can run out for. But you could also use Blessing of Protection or Divine Shield to avoid that damage if need be. But in this case, it looks like in their raid group, they had a little bit of an issue, which caused some downtime there. You can probably hear my cat meowing in the background, being a pest. But we'll get back to the timeline here. Oh. Alright. So that downtime here, that's what lowered the overall usage of Crusader Strike and Judgment, because they were both below what would be considered ideal. So again, when you can't avoid downtime, you want to. But we'll continue on here. Again, so far rotation, it's looking fairly solid. There's no real major issues. There's another little gap here. And we can tell that Crusader Strike was off cooldown. Because Crusader Strike has 2 charges. When a charge is restored, it puts that little white line there to indicate it. So that was up. So there was another gap of downtime there, for whatever reason. There we go. Used Blade before Judgment. That's very good. That's very consistent. That's what you want to see and what you want to do. Just going through the like list, we're not going to go through the entire timeline, but this is how you would do it. You would look for these gaps like list to see if the abilities were on cooldown, which in this case, they were on cooldown. There's nothing available to use. Or if there's another reason possibly, like in this case, Crusader Strike could have been used, but was not used. So, is it because you're moving for mechanics or because you're not paying attention? And you just want to think about that. If you stream or record your kills, you can always watch your kills. You can go to that time of the recording, see what's happening. Or what you could also do, like when we were here, this long period of downtime, we can go to the log. That was about 1 minute, 2 seconds. We can go to the replay. We can choose the person we were watching or choose yourself. We can hit play. And it was around here is where it got a bit tricky. So we're over here. The ads were just killed. I was running over to Rastakhan. And you can see there's fire going out. So right now they're being blocked from getting in. So sometimes things like that happen and it's a bit hard to avoid. But when you can, you want to avoid it. This is just a tool to look to try to further explain why you might have had downtime if it's not obvious. So that's how you would go over your rotation there. Now, other things in the rotation, like I mentioned, it now shows when you have Imperium Power or Divine Purpose. So you can see when Imperium Power is used. You can see it was procced here, and it was used here. And this Imperium Power actually procced Imperium Power again. And again, so a person got some lucky chain procs there. But you can use this to make sure that those procs are being used. We know that Imperium Power lasts for 15 seconds. So if that entire bar is ever full, like here's a case where the Imperium Power is there. We look in here, we don't see any uses of Divine Storm. But you also notice that it was 26 seconds, which means they got 2 Imperium Power procs, but none of them were used. So right here, we lost 2 procs, which is pretty big. You definitely want to make sure to use those when you can. And again, in my guide, in the rotation section, it tells you how to use them, but it falls into the same priority as a Templar's Verdict, with a few extra notes. So if you go here, further considerations, it's like here, do not consume the Judgment debuff with an Imperium Power on single target. You use Templar's Verdict first. And Imperium Power procs take the same priority as Templar's Verdict. Just use Imperium Power first, then use Templar's Verdict. Now, sometimes you might land in a scenario where you have the Judgment debuff up, you have 1 or 2 Holy Power, and you can't build, but Imperium Power is up. In that case, it's okay to consume the Judgment debuff. I'll have to edit this line to make that clear. But if you run into a spot where the Judgment debuff is up and you can't spend first with Holy Power, it's okay to use that proc. It's not going to hurt you. It's better that way. Alright, so another thing we talked about is Judgment. So as far as Judgment use goes, that was good. Blade was being used over it, but also what we'll check is how many were consumed, which if we go to the stats page, we can see here. So in this case, 86.84% of Judgments were consumed. If we mouse over here, we can see there was 38 total. 26 were consumed by Templar's Verdict. 7 were consumed by Divine Storm. So there was just a few Judgments that were not properly used up. Now that can be for various reasons. Again, we've seen there was some downtime in the timeline that could have caused it. Or if you use Judgment on a mob that is dying soon, that can cause it if you don't have enough time to follow up with the spender. Or if for whatever reason you judge twice before using a spender, which that would fall under your rotation in general. Something was going off there. But you want to try to consume as much of those debuffs as possible. But sometimes you just can't because the mobs do die. If the mob is really high priority and you want to make sure it dies, you should use your Judgment. You shouldn't be worrying about not being able to consume it if the mob has to die. If it has to die, it has to die. Or sometimes what happens is intermission phases. You'll judge a boss and then an intermission happens. Like a common thing is on Rastakhan Mythic. When you get frozen, you might judge Rastakhan and then you're frozen. And then depending what happens, that debuff might run out. So just small things to look for. Nothing too huge. Alright, so the other thing that we want to look for, that I do plan on adding some features for, is the use of Divine Storm. So one thing we'll check is we'll go back to the Warcraft logs page here and go to buffs. And let's go back to our person here. So we had 20 Imperium power buffs. And if we go scroll down here, we had 28 Divine Storm casts. So there's 8 extra casts of Divine Storm. And if you really want to break that down, is you would want to go to the damage done. You want to click on your person there. You want to choose Divine Storm, and this is some real nitpicky stuff, but this is an example of what you would do, and you would switch to events. But I do plan on making less display something about WoWAnalyzer, so you don't have to do this. But for now, this is how it works. You can do this, and you can see how many targets were hit with a Divine Storm, and you can line it up to see if Imperium Power was active for it. So in this case, we can see that there's no Imperium Power buff here. So these Divine Storms were used without Imperium Power procs, but we can see here, in this case, the first cast, there was 3 targets hit, so that's good. When you're using Righteous Verdict, you want to hit at least 3 targets. And if you're using Zeal, you can use Divine Storm at 2 or more targets. So pretty much what you would do if you want to really check on it, you would just scroll down this page here and see if you can find an instance of hitting 2 targets. Because in this case, we can, as mentioned earlier, Righteous Verdict is used, so you want to hit at least 3. And if you really want to look, you would go through it like this. And again, I'm just looking here for the Imperium Power buff. And we can see in this case, there was a cast here. And another cast where it was used where only 1 target was hit. So that would be a case of using Divine Storm when you wouldn't want to. But again, I will try to make this simpler with a WoWAnalyzer little toolbox there. But for now, again, that's under damage done. Choose Divine Storm, go to events, look at the time, and see how many hits you got per Divine Storm. And usually, once you realize you have to use Divine Storm a certain way, you don't have to check for this, but when you're first starting out, this might not be so apparent to you. So this is a good way to see what's going on. Alright, so one thing we mentioned in the timeline portion was you could see downtime very easily, like with the gaps between abilities, depending how short or long they are. And also on statistics, it does show downtime percentage. So in this case, there was a fair amount of downtime, and some of that downtime did come down to how the guild was doing on the fight. It was a bit sporadic. It wasn't a very clean kill, which caused this person to not always be in range. But you want to do what you can to optimize your uptime on the boss. But when you do have to run out for a mechanic, you want to run out. You don't want to screw over your raid, because when you are raiding, it's you and 19 other people. It's not just you. So you have to think about more than yourself when you are raiding, especially at a competitive level or mythic or even heroic. Whatever is competitive to you, there's other people who rely on you to do your job, so you should do your job as best as that you can. So again, downtime in this case, it's best seen from the timeline. Downtime in this log was a little bit high. So another common topic we mentioned earlier was Righteous Verdict. And there's a little display here for damage done. And there's a tooltip here that says the effective damage contributed by Righteous Verdict. So total damage was 2.67%, and the buffed cast were 73.85%. And when you look at Righteous Verdict, you look for the benefit or the buffed cast. You don't look for uptime. Uptime is meaningless. It's all about how much damage it did and how many casts were buffed. Now in this case, it was under 3% of damage done, which is not ideal. So in this case, it would have been better to use Zeal on this fight. On AoE fights, if you find yourself falling below like 3.3 or 3.2% damage, you should probably be using Zeal instead. It'll provide you a little bit more DPS overall. Now on the other side, if there's a fight where there's some AoE which causes your damage to be lower, but there are important priority targets that need to die, such as an example is Uldir on early Vectis progress when the Amalgam spawned, you would probably still want to continue using Righteous Verdict on progress to make sure you can single target those ads down and to make sure they died. So that is a judgment call you have to make for yourself. But on a single target fight, you can definitely have 5% or higher damage done and 80% or more buffed cast from Righteous Verdict. So on single target, if you find yourself falling below about 3.8% of your damage, you probably want to consider using Zeal as well. And the important thing about Righteous Verdict is that it does not change your rotation. It is a passive talent, and you should treat it as a passive. If you look at my guide, there's not a single mention of Righteous Verdict in the rotation. The only time it gets mentioned is in regards to Divine Storm usage, which we mentioned earlier. That's because you do not modify your rotation for Righteous Verdict. If you do your rotation properly, the benefits are passive. If you do your rotation well, you will get good damage from this talent. If you don't do your rotation well, you will get bad damage. So again, it's all about making sure you're just executing properly. All right. There's a couple other things here we'll just go over in general. Like when you go to WoWAnalyzer, it brings you to the overview page here first. This checklist is still here. If you want to use it, you can expand these. You can read the suggestions. It gives you some suggestions here. You can see something that happened here, which is a major issue, is try to cast Avenging Wrath more often and try to cast Rapid Adaptation more often. 2 of 4 possible casts. So we can see this fight was nearly 7.5 minutes, but Wings was only used twice. Now Wings, you want to use it on cooldown as much as possible. If there's going to be downtime or an intermission phase, like such as on Mechatork, if the intermission is about to happen, you want to hold your Wings. But on a fight like Rastakhan on Heroic, there is no reason to hold your Wings. You want to make sure you're using it. So a lot of damage was lost here just by not using Wings enough and not using the Trinket enough with Wings. So that's something you want to look out for. And another way to check that is from the stats page. If you scroll down, it shows you your ability usage, like item and cooldown. So definitely look out for that. You want to make sure you're maximizing your cooldowns. Cooldowns are a very important window. Now in this case, because Avenging Wrath was being used, it's a little bit different. There's not such a high focus on doing a proper cooldown rotation, because there isn't really one. But when you're using a talent like Crusade is a bit different. So we'll go over to another log here. Alright, so we're on another log here. We'll go to the timeline. And we can see in this case, this person is using Crusade. And you might notice that their first Crusade has a red square around it, and it says, make sure to have at least 3 Holy Power before using Crusade. Ideally, you should have 5 Holy Power before using Crusade after your first use. So in this case, it was the first use, and they went in Crusade without 3 Holy Power. So they went Judgment, Crusade, Wake, and then their Trinket. So again, for the opener part, this would be not an ideal opener. You would want to use either Blade then Judgment, or Judgment then Blade, and then you would go into Crusade, and then you would pop your Trinket and use Templar's Verdict, and then you would have used your Wake. And you can see in this case as well for Wake, there's another reason why it can be used improperly, which I have it highlighted. It says 1 Holy Power was wasted, while Blade of Justice was off cooldown. Use Blade of Justice and a Holy Power Spender before using Wake. So this is an example of Wake getting used at 1, while Blade is available. Now in this case, it's a bit different because it's the opener, and the opener was not done correctly. And what we'll do, we also want to look at the later Crusades in the fight, so we'll scroll across. We can see here, make sure to have at least 3 Holy Power before using Crusade. Ideally have 5 after your opener. So in this case, when you go into Crusade, your goal is for your first ability to always be a spender. So you always want to have at least 3 Holy Power, and if you can, even if it takes wetting a 2 or 3 GCDs, you want to build to 5 first. So you can go Crusade, then you would use Trinket and Templar's Verdict, or Divine Storm if AoE. Then you would use a Spender, and then you would use Templar's Verdict again to get to 7 stacks really fast. Because the goal in Crusade is to get to 10 stacks as fast as possible. Once you're at 10 stacks, that's when you are doing the most damage you can be doing. So you want to make sure to maximize those windows. It's very important when using Crusade. Now for Avenging Wrath, it's not the same. You don't have to have Holy Power before you go into Avenging Wrath. But for Crusade, you definitely want to. Back to the first log. So again, we went over Crusader Strike. There was some downtime. Judgment, there was some downtime. Hammer Wrath, you can't really tell how many you could use because it's special how it works. It's either used in wings or it's used on low health targets. And the cat is back. Alright, cat. I'll pet you later, okay? You can see other abilities like Shield of Vengeance. We'll go over that in a moment. And some utility as well if you want to use, if you use utility or consumables, that's also all there. So the big takeaways here were there was some downtime, which caused some low use of Judgment and Crusader Strike. There was a couple missed casts of wings, which we definitely want to avoid. We want to make sure to use wings as much as possible. Now, Shield of Vengeance. That's another topic. Shield of Vengeance is a pseudo-defensive, in my opinion. People tend to use it more of a DPS cooldown, and on most fights it is used as a DPS cooldown. There are a few exceptions where fights are pretty hectic, where you don't want to cheese it, such as a fight like a Mechatork on Mythic. There's a lot of damage going out, like from gigavolts, and just in the intermission phase. So sometimes it's better to use it defensively, but when you can, especially on a fight like Rastakhan, you can use it offensively. And there's a little display here which we get. It says Shield of Vengeance Absorb used. In this case, 95.15%, which is very good. You want to be as close to 100 as possible. And if you need tips on how you could cheese your Shield of Vengeance on my guide, up top here there's a Mythic Rating tab for Battle of Dazara lore. And it has some general boss tips and talent recommendations. Now this is for Mythic, but a lot of these same Mythic mechanics are also on Heroic sometimes, so some of the mechanics do overlap, so you can tend to use them the same way. So if we go to Rastakhan, some examples are Shield of Vengeance can be used on Poison Toad Slime and Withering Burst. So Poison Toads, when the toads spawn. Withering Burst is when people who are down below are clearing their debuff. It does damage to the people upstairs. And just other fights have other examples. Like here on Mechatork, like Shield of Vengeance is probably best used defensively on this fight. Dropping Gigavolt Charge and the Intermission are good places it can be used to stay alive. You know, some general benefits there. But let's go over a few more things on WoWAnalyzer. So this is a stats page. It's a little bit different. we got some of our same displays, such as downtime, distance move, damage done by rep buff, Art of War procs used, holy power wasted. And there's some new things here where it shows your total DPS, HPS, and damage taken. It also gives you a little timeline preview here of that damage profile. And if you click on these little bars, this will bring up the log in Warcraft logs, which I did earlier. You click on that, and it brings up the log. But we'll go back here. It also shows you a little percent here, where it compares your DPS to the DPS of a top 100 player. Now, this is just a piece of info. If you're curious of how much DPS it takes to be in the top 100, this is what it tells you. If you want to set this as a goal for yourself, you can do that, but you definitely shouldn't take that number as a deterrent or as an indication that you're doing really good or really bad. The best way to tell if you're doing good or bad is by going over your logs. We went over the Wake of Ashes here. There's also Art of War procs used. You definitely want to make use of your Art of War procs. In this case, there was 93.33% used, so that was good. You look over here, 15 Art of War procs total, 14 were used, so only one was missed. Some stats from your items and enchants, like the average benefit and uptime of your trinket, of your weapon enchant, of Azerite traits, like Treacherous Covenant. We can see here that there is a 95% uptime on Treacherous Covenant. And in this case, there was a 0 debuff uptime, so there was never any extra damage taken. This is a good display to see if you might want to consider switching to a different Azerite trait. If you find that you're taking a lot of damage, you can check your log on the analyzer. And if it's popping up, you might want to consider switching. And there was one small thing I wanted to show off here that I forgot. And you can probably hear Cat in the background again. It's knocking some change off the table. All right, so let's wrap this up. So let's find the log. I have a couple of them open. All right, so under items, so one of the traits we have is Indomitable Justice, where Judgment deals additional damage when your health percentage exceeds your target up to 5,750 damage, or whatever damage, X damage. I've added this little benefit here. It shows you how much benefit you got from the trait. So it says Indomitable Justice value is determined by a comparison of your health versus your target's health. This is the estimated value. So the most damage you can do is when you're at full health and your target has low health, your bonus damage is a lot higher. If you and your target have the same health, there's no bonus damage. If you have less health than your target, there's 0 bonus damage there. It can't decrease your damage, it can only increase your damage. So in this case here, it was at a 90.49% benefit. Now this is something that you could use to determine if your sim is telling you that Indomitable Justice is simming better. You can look at some of your logs and see your benefit. If your benefit isn't in the 90s or the high 90s, you might want to consider using a different trait. So this is a very helpful display to determine that. And that was pretty much all I wanted to cover. I covered some of the new things here, went over some of the same things, how to find them. Again, just to be clear, this is all the same info as here. It's a new display. The overview is there for the checklist and suggestions. The stats page here is for your item stats and character and like procs and things of that nature. Also, holy power usage and abilities. Timeline is still here. It's a little bit different. The cooldowns tab is still there. It shows you how much damage you did during that cooldown window. You can expand that, of course, and see what you did. You can show even more. The character page we talked about. And there's the About tab, just a little bit of information there. Now, it says it's outdated, but it's not. I need to update it to say 8.1.5, but this is up to date. It does have more information here. It gives you a link to the Paladin Discord. It tells you the FAQ channel has good information for you. It tells you that Ret General has memes if you want memes. There's a Ret Questions channel for asking questions. We got a link to our available guides here as well. And it mentions that these guides also feature encounter tips like I showed you on my guide. A little bit of a change log there, which you can change that to see when stuff was added. And if you do have any WoWAnalyzer suggestions, you can definitely reach out to them in their Discord. Or if you have anything about Ret you want to see, if you let me know, I can see if I can add it myself. But I hope you found this informative, and if you have any questions, please let me know. And I hope you all have a great day.